Okay, sorry about that. This will be divided up into two videos because my computer had a glitch in it. So I'm going to get right back into it here. um, so yeah, we felt unsafe at the hospital. They eventually ended up working with us. Okay. So we ended up, part of our shaken baby journey was a 90-day hospital because of a bowel resection. So usually this doesn't happen in a child her age. She was over a year old. Happened really like almost exactly a year after she was shaken. But she had GI issues, and so she was more susceptible to things happening within her GI system. Um, so a major event happened to where she was really about to die again. And so she had been in and out of the hospital for little things like some respiratory symptoms and a cold, things like that. So this was the first very serious thing she went through about a year after she was shaken. So she had kind of like I thought was a stomach virus. She had thrown up a few times. And I knew something was wrong when she vomits because she never had anything on her stomach. So she couldn't vomit. So it wasn't just like, oh, your child gets a stomach virus and they, throw up everything that they've eaten or drank. So this picture on the left shows she was very irritable all weekend. And I know that I've said that before that she was irritable a lot, but there were times where she wasn't. And so, but this time she wasn't not irritable, if that makes sense. So I had noticed that something was going on with her, and I didn't know if it was like a super, emergency, but I knew that I was probably going to end up having to take her to be seen because it was the weekend and the doctor's office wasn't open. Well, so she was kind of starting to act lethargic. You can see around her eyes, it was like turning a little gray. And so she just looked very weak. And so she had this yellow, like bile stuff coming out of her G tube, which we kept vented. So I always kept a tube connected to her G tube, which was like allowing the gas to come out of her stomach. And I usually just kept like a bag or something connected to that so that if any like stomach bile did come out, it could be collected in that bag. Well, it was never yellow, bright yellow. It was always just regular, just clear fluid. So when I saw this yellow stuff starting to come out, I was like, this is alarming to me. I've never seen this before in a whole year of taking care of her. Something's going on. And then she would have a little bit of vomit coming out of her mouth, which never happened because, again, she had gastroparesis and never had anything on her stomach. So something was happening. And I assumed that it was like backing up somehow into her stomach. Something was, didn't know what. So I called her GI doctor on call and I said, explained what was happening. She was acting lethargic. She had this yellow stuff coming out of her tube. It never happens. She has gastroparesis, all these things I was explaining. And they're like, well, just keep it on her. It can wait until Monday and then you can make an appointment. And they were like, there's no need to take her to the ER at this point. So usually what would happen would be I'd call one of her doctors and they would call ahead to the ER and say, hey, this person's coming and this is their issue. It just made it easier on us to not have to go in there and explain everything in the middle of trying to get her, seen by an emergency doctor. So she continued on into the night. I had worked all day. Someone in my family or a nurse watched her, probably someone in my family at this point. So when I came home in the second picture, you see how like these veins were being very prominent in her chest and her upper stomach area. And that doesn't seem like a big deal either, because sometimes you'll see veins in your arms and stuff that you don't usually see, but those veins were just like showing up so prominently that I was like, why is this happening? This is, you know, if you follow your intuition, it's usually correct, especially as a mom. You have to, like, your child best. And especially in this situation, I knew her better than anyone because I was with her the most and knew all of her medical background and all that stuff. So I knew this was alarming. I was like, I just don't think it can wait. Like, I'm listening to this doctor. He says the yellow stuff is completely normal. He sees it all the time and it's not anything unusual. Just slow her feed some and until she can get seen. So I was trying not to be alarmed and trying to just trust that he knew what he's talking about. So then in the third picture, you see how it's like that this reddish brownish color coming out of around her GJ tube area. So like nothing ever came out of this hole in her stomach because there's a balloon like underneath that where the feed goes in. And so there's not like space for fluids to like leak out of there. That never happened. And every once in a while, maybe. And we just kept those things like in the second picture, you can see that little blue thing that's around it. That's just to keep it dry and not, you know, just basically to keep her skin from getting irritated. So when I started to see that kind of color coming, I was like, I don't care at this point what they say. I'm going to take her to the ER. Like something is wrong. And it seemed like she was getting swollen. So like you can see how in that third picture that was after we had arrived at the ER. My mom went with me. I called her and I was like, Mom, I'm exhausted. I can't even carry her. I had been doing massage all day long. I did like 5 or 6 massages and I was just so tired. Like I can't even carry her at this point. I need help. And so she went with me in the middle of the night to take her to the ER. And then another family member, watched my older daughter because at this point I was still a single mom. So we get there and they're like, well, we can't see anything wrong with her. And like that third picture, you can see her stomach is like kind of distended out some to the point to where it's swollen enough to push out that little I forget what it's called, but where her feed goes in, you can see how it's pushing it out. And that never happened. It always fit very well into the skin. And so I'm just like, you can see that there's something wrong. She doesn't, and that yellow stuff started coming out of her mouth too. Anyways, so I was still following my intuition saying, well, I'm here because I know something's wrong with her. So we sat there all night long. They did nothing about it. They finally admitted us and said, we will just keep an eye on her. And so in the fourth picture, you can see that she just looked very weak and kind of lethargic, and she just did not look like her normal self. Um, even though her normal self was not like a healthy child in the first place, but she definitely didn't look healthy. So that story continues here. Like the yellow stuff was coming out of her mouth. Well, we get admitted, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go to sleep. It's like 7 a.m. by then the next day. They could not find anything, they said. So I was like, okay, I guess there's nothing wrong with her. Maybe I am wrong. Maybe my intuition is not right here and she's actually just fine. And this is just a normal little thing. So I was trying to go to sleep and then they come running in the room around 7 a.m. that day. And we're like, we have to take her for a stat CT scan, which is what you see in the third picture there, because she's an organ failure. We ran some blood tests and her organs are failing. And I was like, okay, yes, I knew something was wrong, but now I'm freaking out because they're rushing her to the CT place and it's just a freak out moment where they should have probably discovered this hours ago in the ER. So what started as, oh, this is nothing, then turned into a very serious situation where they said that the CT scan showed that it was her intestines that were extremely swollen and they were pushing up hard on her lungs, which was making it look like she was an organ failure in her other organs. So because of that, they had to go to do emergency surgery. And this was a Sunday, so there's no surgeons there. There's no surgery scheduled. So they had to call in a surgeon who was an amazing person to, come in there on their day off to do this surgery on a child who they could have looked at and been like, she's not worth working on. I mean, they could have done that. So this is some photos of that day because I called in a friend who was a photographer, and I was like, I think, they were telling me she is going to die. So when they came into the room after the CT scan, they were like, you need to say goodbye to her. She's going to die. Like the anesthesiologist came in the room, and you have to like sign the paper saying that you understand the risks and stuff. And usually that's the end of it. Well, the anesthesiologist came up to me and circled death and said, this is most likely the outcome. I want you to understand that when she goes under anesthesia today, she is probably not going to live. And I was like, okay, you got to help her though. Like, I'm not going to just stand here um, and just say, oh, well, she's not, she's not worth it. It's fine. Just don't even worry about it. And I bring that up because I get a lot of like comments from people, on social media. I don't think anyone said this to me like in person to my face, but like especially social media, where people are just extra judging of you. Anyways, they have said things like, how could you keep her alive? You should have let her die. Um, you're a terrible mom to put her through that. Well, I had this baby like on this day, especially when it comes to like something like this, where it's like, do you give her surgery or do you just let her die? My child was fighting. I mean, she was fighting to live. And even the doctors were like, she's just trying to fight so hard right now to stay alive because she was dying and her body was trying to basically shut down. And so I can't even imagine the pain she was in. Like it hurts me to think about, to stop to think how bad would it hurt for your intestines to be so swollen that it was pushing on your lungs and your organs, and like it hurts to even think about that. Um, but and especially, I have struggled with all of that happened to her because of someone's choice too. So, anyways, I'm trying to stay on track. So, um, they come in, tell me that she is basically going to die. Oh, about the comments that I get with that I should just let her die. So she's fighting for her life. And I am not going, like, I never felt right about saying, like, especially in this moment, don't help her. Just let her die. Like if you really think about that moment and how that would feel and how you would feel with your child laying there, like it's easy to say, oh, you shouldn't have done that. You should just let her die. Why wasn't she a DNR? All of these things. But when you look at your child who's fighting to live, who first was healthy, who had their life taken from them by somebody, who fought to live through being shaken and coding, she fought, even though she did not have this capacity, this brain capacity to like the parts of the brain where have that willpower and will to fight. She somehow still had this will to live. And whether that can be called instinct or not, but she was trying to live. And so I wasn't going to take that from her. And I definitely wasn't going to put her in a position of extreme pain and dying a death that was extremely painful by just saying, just let her intestines swell until they explode inside of her. I mean, that's what the trade-off is. That's what people don't realize when they're judging other people is if I just let her die in this process, it would have been that. It would have been just a very extremely painful death. So something to think about if like judge someone who allows their child to be on like a breathing tube when they can't breathe on their own. So if this tube is removed, they would die. And then it's easy to judge and say, well, why don't you just let that happen? Why would you keep them alive when they were there relying on this tube? But you don't know the entire situation, just like in this situation. So back to the story. So she goes into this emergency surgery. The surgeon gets there, and I'm just sitting in this waiting room, and I'm just going to tell part of this story. So I'm sitting here thinking about what's happening, and I'm just looking at the floor thinking, I don't want to walk out of here without a baby in my car seat. So, I brought her there in her car seat. And I just kept thinking, like, I don't want to walk out of here with an empty car seat. I'm not ready for her to go. And you're never ready for your child to go. And so, but it just didn't feel like she was going to die, even though they said she is going to die. Um, and so I had to come to the moment of like, I have got to surrender this and be okay with whatever happens because I don't have control. And, there's a lot of situations in life where you have to realize you don't have control over it. And so the more that you can just surrender to that, to knowing that you don't have control over the exact situation, but you have control over how you react. And so I did my best to just stay calm and to know that whatever happened, that I was going to be okay and that, you know, the situation would be okay and that she would be okay whether she did live or not. So, anyways, I had to come to terms with all of that, just sitting there waiting. And I think it was probably like 2 hours, maybe. So they came out to give an update. So when she went in, they were like, we're probably going to have to remove most of her bowel. And she's going to have like I think it's called a stoma bag, something like that, where they have to remove the intestines. And so you don't have those functioning. So you have to put a bag to collect all of the waste. So I was like, great, another thing she's going to have to deal with. And so I'm sitting there like, I had my pastor come, some friends come, my family, and they were just there with me. They prayed for me. They were just there to be a support, which was very comforting because, like I was saying, like it says Hal Photography here. That's because I called my doula from my first birth, which was Briley, or no, from Krista's birth. And so she knew who Krista was. And I said, I think this is it. Like, could you come take some photos? I want to remember this. I want, some people think it's weird to take like photos in serious moments and stuff, but like, I want to remember this and look back because in the moment, the way at least my brain works is if I'm going through trauma, like my brain just shuts down and I can't remember things. And so when I have someone like to take photos and stuff, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that now because I'm looking back at this photo. Otherwise, I wouldn't remember it. So, you know, don't be afraid to let people take photos and stuff if you're in a position where, you may one day want to look back at it. And then also to spread awareness and talk about these things. Okay, so the doctor comes in, which you see at the photo at the bottom, and says it wasn't as bad as we thought. We removed a small piece of the intestine that was dead, and she most likely had some kind of infection. No one caught on to it. We had actually been at the GI doctor probably a week before or a few days before, and they didn't even like catch this. And then in a few days, it was an emergency surgery. So no one caught on to it somehow. And I guess it happened very fast. So she was alive, which was actually kind of a shock at that point. And so we went to the ICU where she stayed. And I guess I should warn you before the next pictures. So the next photos, I'm trying to be real here. I'm trying to show you the real deal, what really happens to these children, or what can happen. And so the next slides is going to show where they had to remove her intestines and put them in a bag outside of her body to heal. Because they had to cut out a piece of her intestine, they couldn't just sew it back together because if you did that, it would cause what they call sludging, which is where it would leak out everywhere and cause a bunch of issues and infection. So they have to leave them unattached long enough for each side to heal for them to be able to sew them back together. So I don't have like a photo that's like extremely graphic, but you will see that bag and you can kind of see like her intestines in that bag. So that sounds horrific. I know it sounds like a horror movie and it kind of felt that way. But I want to warn you before I go to that next slide. So you can see this is basically what I walked into the PICU, Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, which is what we were very familiar with. I walked in to see her laying there. She's in an induced coma. She's on life support. again, all of a sudden, whenever we had went an entire year without any kind of like life support and stuff, um, to allow this to heal. So they were telling me this is going to take a very long time. You're going to be here. You better plan to be at this hospital for a long time. If she survives the next few days, we'll find out if she's going to have an infection and it caused her to pass away. She's going to get septic, and we have no idea what's going to happen. She could never heal. She could end up, losing more intestine. Like, we're just going to have to see. So here I am back in this tragic or traumatic situation of like, are you kidding me? It was just a year ago. And now here we are again facing, is she ever going to wake up again? Or is she ever going to recover? So again, she wanted to fight for her life. And so I was going to support her in that. And so, they had to give her lots of pain medications. They had to keep her in a induced coma for at least a few days. And after, let's see, I think it was a week. Let me see what's on the next slide. Okay, so after like a week, they thought she was having another infection. So they took her back to surgery, which is what you see on the left, like an emergency surgery again. They came in and told me she's got to go for emergency surgery and she's probably not going to survive. And so I was actually, I think, alone at that time. And she, of course, made it through. And when she came out, they were like, oh, it was actually better than we expected. So we actually kind of put some of that back in. How am I going to move this? So like at this upper right corner, you can see that they like closed the wound there. And she was actually ended up kind of better than she went in there. So their expectations were, I guess, off. But so this continued. This is like the 90 days of being in the hospital. So for most of those days, they didn't know how she was going to respond. Couldn't tell me anything about how long she would be there. We went through lots of struggles during that time with just a bunch of different things with her. But she survived. So like at that bottom right corner, you could see, well, okay, so the big question I get is how she gained so much weight. So in most of these photos and stuff, you see that she's a smaller baby, even though she's a year old. Well, this visit was what caused her to end up gaining a ton of weight because they could not put anything in her intestines, even through her J tube. So, how was she supposed to survive with no nutrition? Well, they did something called TPN, which is like an IV nutrition. You can't survive forever off of that because it just wears your veins out and stuff. But, so that caused a lot of issues because they would try to put it in her skin as a temporary fix and it would blow up her skin. And it was a very stressful, traumatic time. But she eventually was able to get TPN through like an IV or through a PICC line, I think it was. And so don't quote me on that one, but I think it was a PICC line that they eventually put it through. And because it can't just be like a regular IV, it has to be like a bigger opening than that, I guess. So she received all of that, and that's how she stayed alive. Well, she did eventually heal. They sewed her up completely. She healed enough to start trying feeds again, and she ended up at the bottom right there. She was like in a, healing phase. And after 90 days of fighting that, she got to leave the hospital. So like you can see the transformation from these, I don't know if it'll come up. Like this baby here, like look at her face, how sick she was compared to this baby. It just looks completely different. She looks so much healthier. So anyway, she had this big scar from then on in her stomach, and that's her sister there. We finally got to go home after 90 days. It felt like I was leaving prison. Because first of all, you're looking up at all these windows of the hospital, and it just looks kind of like prison. But then it just feels like, man, my freedom was gone for 90 days. Like I not to have like self-pity on myself, but it is a struggle for parents too. Um, I had to like fight to be able to go to work. I had bills to pay. I had people support us and help us as much as they could. Um, but I still needed to like keep a job and go to work. And 90 days is a long time to be out of work as a single parent. And so it was a fight for both of us, but she fought and she lived. And you can see, like, she didn't have brain function. It's so hard to explain that when they look at her brain on a scan, that that reminds me of a story I want to tell real quick. So, this is the 90-day hospital stay. Well, there was one time before this where her pupils were like dilating and, they were looking funny to me. So I knew at that point she was blind. This was probably, I don't know, 6 months after she got out of the hospital originally for her shaken baby syndrome stay the first time. And I tell this because I feel like it's important to know. Um, so her eyes, you could still see she had blue eyes. You could still see the blue part, and they looked normal. Well, as time went on, and she had blood behind her eyes, so her retinas didn't detach when she was shaken. And that's like a big sign of shaken baby syndrome is when they come in and their retinas are detached because it was from where their, brain was going back and forth and caused that force to do that. So hers weren't, but she had a lot of blood behind her eyes. So they didn't know at first if she was really blind or if it was just the blood. So I noticed that her pupils were acting funny and she would have this eye movement that would just go like back and forth, back and forth. And so I took her to the ER just because, I didn't really think it was like an emergency, but I thought, well, what if she has like some kind of stroke? I don't even know if she has the ability to have a stroke without, the brain being there, but I just want to get her checked out, or if she's having seizures, because she did have seizures when she was first shaken for a while, and then she kind of like eased off of that and didn't seem to have any more seizures for a very long time. So I thought, oh no, she's having seizures again. I'm gonna take her. Well, my mom and I took her to the ER at that time, around 6 months old, or 6 months after her injury. And so we're sitting there in the ER thinking, okay, we're just getting her checked out. It's not a huge deal. And so the doctor comes in and says, well, I've called DCS because she's been injured again. Well, she first went back for a CT scan, just to see what was going on in her head. And then the doctor comes in and says, well, we had the CT scan done and I called DCS because she's been injured again. And so I know that she's only been with me and she's only been with a nurse at our house. And we had cameras and everything. And so I'm pretty sure at that point we had cameras. So there was no way that she had been injured. And so, I stood up and I was like, no, you're going to go and find out what is really wrong with her because she has not been injured and you're wrong. And so, she's like, okay, okay. Well, then she comes back in, I don't know, 30 minutes later. I don't think we had to talk to DCS. And she says, I'm trying to think of exactly what she said, but it was something like, oh, I'm sorry, we were wrong. The person who's doing the CT scans today is actually does it for adults. They're not like an expert in child CT scans, and so they just didn't know. But we're going to send you to the ICU and they're going to explain to you what's actually going on. So I was like, okay, now I'm like on the defense. I'm sweating like crazy, like that's just like the mental trauma that a parent in this situation can go through, and not just like an abusive situation, but also just a special needs parent who has to go through all these things. So we're sent to the ICU, and the doctor there explained what was actually being seen. So they thought that they were seeing a bunch of blood all over her brain. Well, what actually happened was her brain liquefied, which also sounds like a horror movie, but the brain liquefied because it had been dead for, 6 months or more, and then it turned into liquid. So they were actually seeing liquid from it just turning into liquid because nothing is there, and they weren't seeing blood on the brain. So, okay, I can get how they made that mistake. but it's still like just jumping so fast to conclusions and putting me through that um was, hurtful. So she wasn't in like any danger or anything, but that can happen. Who knew that I was ever going to have to hear that, and that's something that happens. I'm trying to paint a real picture here of like a real case of shaken baby syndrome and what it can really do. It's not just a one-time injury. It's not just something you deal with unless they pass away, but even then, the parents, the person who it hurts, doesn't just deal with it in one day and get over it. It never ends. So, um, we, oh, my light is messing up over here. I'm sorry. Okay. So she was fine that time, but I just wanted to bring that story because it just came to my mind and I don't have slides for it. But back to this stay here after her bowel resection. So, of course, she survived. She had really no issues after that. It was just kind of getting her, I'm sorry, this light is messing up here. Kind of getting her just back to being able to take her normal feeds because she wasn't able to take them after that. She got put on formula that was like really, so the TPN, I'm sorry, the TPN that she was put on during this stay, she ended up gaining a lot of weight. I'm sorry about the sliding if you can't really see me that well. So she ended up gaining a lot of weight, and that's how she ended up she couldn't lose it. She's not active. She doesn't do anything to lose weight. And so even though they tried by putting her on like the lowest calorie formula, she just kept gaining weight. So in the next slides and stuff, you'll end up seeing where she appears, larger. So throughout all this time of her, you know, being just going through her journey, we had a person who helped us start this page just to keep everybody updated. So we started this Prayers for Krista page on Facebook at like the beginning of this journey that we had. And she started that for me because, for one, to just keep everybody updated because there was just so many people to update. So it has grown over time to now there's 165,000 followers on there. And I tell you that because this is very important to me. The reason why I like still keep this page going is because this is spreading awareness of shaken baby syndrome. This is how people know about this and see that this exists and think about this because, back when this happened in 2017 to us, I really didn't see this stuff. And maybe if I had seen a story like this, then I would have been more aware and not in so much denial. And so that's my hope with this Facebook page is, first of all, if you're a person on here and you've like supported us throughout the years, I want to say thank you because it's a big deal to support someone when they're going through the worst thing in their entire life. But anyways, I'm just bringing this up because this is one of the reasons why I'm telling you this story right now is to help spread awareness. And then also, if you do want to follow along, I do post things on there constantly. Well, not constantly, but I post things on there. So that's the way that you can kind of like see more of the details of this story if you want to see more than what I'm giving you, which I hope I'm giving you most of everything. Okay, so fast forward a little bit to 2019, and that is when I married my current husband, Canyon. And so, there's not really anything to say about that other than, okay, let's say you find yourself in a bad position like this. And so I kind of want to speak to that for a moment because I felt a lot in those times of being single. And after being in such a, toxic, terrible marriage and relationship before, my self worth was pretty low. And now I don't find myself worth in other people, and things like that. But I thought for a long time that I would never find anyone who would accept me in my position with a special needs child, and it being such a dramatic story with the person still being involved in some way, because we were still doing supervised visitations at this point. Um, and who a person who would come in and help. And I needed that. I needed the help. I didn't want to be alone and struggling through this every day on my own. And then someone to accept my older daughter. And so you may find yourself in positions in life where you feel like, man, this is never going to end. Nothing good is going to come of this. And maybe even like, I'm never going to find someone who will love me and care for me. And, if you have kids, care for my kids. But I'm here to be that, living proof that it can happen. So I found that man, or that man found me, and, he was sent to me. And um, so, yes, this is my current husband, Kenyon. There's Krista and our older daughter, Briley. And, you know, he just took us as we were, and he stepped into this position of, being a father with, he didn't have any kids of his own, and he had never been married. And so we were like 24 years old, I believe, 23. And so he stepped in and took over. And, you know, one of my biggest blessings for sure in life. So thankful for him. He would go to the hospital with Krista when needed. He'd help me with whatever I needed. He helped support us and provide for us. And just an amazing like turnaround of the story of where it isn't all bad. Good things can happen still, which is what I needed to see. Now what did come along, which is one reason why I'm here to help these families of, shaken baby syndrome, is because when you're not a single parent anymore, a lot of things change. So there were more worries about money and less support from people. So, for example, as a single parent with a lower income, I was able to get a lot of, government help for because of my special needs daughter. So she qualified for things because I had a low income and I was a single parent. Okay. And so I could get more help with certain things for her. Now, when you get married and your income increases, then you get less help, which is fine, but it causes more worries and more struggles. And then individual people are less likely to help you. When you see a story of like, we've been stuck in the hospital for this long, but we have two parents providing. Well, you're less likely to help than the single mom who can't go to work and, can't do anything. But it's still a struggle, even when it is a family unit. And so that's one reason I have created this course and shared this story to begin with, is to be able to help these families, because just because there's two parents doesn't exactly take off the financial stress, because one parent is usually still in and out of the hospital. The other parent is still taking care of the home by themselves, and it's still a very stressful situation, and they're missing work and things are happening. And, where both parents do have to miss work, you're being told your child might pass away. So like, of course you're going to end up not going to work that day, things like that. Um, just another part of our journey. Um, so in January of 2020, we all know what happened, major event in 2020. Well, in January of 2020, first of all, my husband, Kenyon, and we found out we were expecting, and then I had a miscarriage. Well, of course, right at that time, I had to go for surgery because it was a, specific miscarriage issue. And so as I'm getting surgery and stuff, Krista ended up with this horrible, sudden respiratory issue to where she could barely breathe, and she had to go to the hospital and was admitted. And so that's just another traumatic situation. Um, But so back to that. So she ended up surviving that, but there was some times that she really had trouble. She had to be intubated, and again with the DNR stuff. So like people will say, why didn't you make her a DNR? Why would you intubate her? Things like that. And really the answer for that is because she was fighting for her life. So if there was ever a time that I felt like, oh, she's given up, like she does not want to live, she's just laying around. There is no sign of her fighting at all. I'm sorry, I'm trying to fix this lighting. I just don't want it to be so dark that you can't see me. Um, then maybe I would have considered like maybe she should be a DNR, because if I had seen that from her, like she was trying to pass away and I was keeping her alive, that's a different scenario to me. And so I might have, considered DNR at that point. But up until this point in January 2020, I wasn't considering that for her. So she did end up surviving that hospital stay where she was intubated, but they could not find out what this mystery thing was. So now we know like what happened in February and March of 2020. And like they tested her for RSV and everything in January of 2020, but they couldn't figure out what this thing was. So we probably can like guess what she had now. But so daily life with Krista. I'm just going to talk about this for just a minute because I haven't really went into it, but she pretty much I'll just walk you through like a day of how she, what it was like to care for her and stuff. So in the mornings, we would go in before a nurse usually worked like either 7 to 7 or some kind of shift like that. We eventually got it increased. So over time, I didn't go into detail about this, but over time, I had to keep like advocating for more nursing hours because we just couldn't work whenever she needed a caregiver 24/7. And we both needed to try to work, So um eventually we just kept advocating for it and um pushing for more hours, and she did eventually get more hours. So she even got some nights at some point whenever the nursing company could find nights, because there's another issue. You can get approved for the nursing care, but then not even get it because there's no staff. So, anyways, usually a nurse would come in around 7 a.m. So before that, she needed medication. So we would go in there. And another struggle that I, had to like deal with and cope with was not knowing if I would go in there to her being alive. So the doctor's prognosis for her was that they just didn't know. Basically, they said she would either get an infection and pass away, which almost happened, or her brain, the piece that was still there, would just shut down and it would be too much for her body would be too much for it to function on just that small piece of brain. So that was their prognosis. And so I never knew, like, even though she would kind of sleep at night and we could leave her alone in her hospital bed and stuff and go to sleep ourselves, I didn't know if I would walk in there to her being alive or not. And like, okay, you never really know that for sure. No one's ever promised another day, but it's just something about like, it is a relief to not have to really feel that anymore, to worry about walking into a child who's not breathing. Um, so the mornings we would go in and give her medications, change out her feeds if needed, or start feeds, or fix the feeds if something was going on with them. And then the nursing care would come usually. You know, we eventually got some like really good nurses who would come consistently, but that is also kind of a struggle to find. So there would be times where there would be no nurse. She would usually have a bath. So we had a bath chair for her that we did get. And then you kind of, she couldn't move, so you had to rotate her so she didn't get bed sores. You had to do her bedding. You can see in that photo that was her hospital bed, and she had these really awesome pillows that were like kind of firm, but they came from the hospital. Every time we'd go to the hospital, I would like, can you get me more of those pillows to take home with us, because they were really good for positioning. So I think they're like specific positioning pillows for um, those with special needs like that. Um, so we'd have to rotate her. And then you can see like there's pads underneath her in case she had an accident, things like that. So just spending time with her, I never wanted her to be alone in her room for very long, because it just felt like although she didn't have a brain, she knew who we were. And like it seemed like she could always recognize our voices, like the main nurse that she had. It seemed like she could recognize her voice, my voice, and like it would calm her. And so it did feel like it calmed her a lot. Even though she shouldn't have understood that, Because like we were even at the neurologist once when the doctor was like, wow, your voice, I could tell that she calmed down when you talked. So we spent time with her. And the emotional side of things, like I kind of mentioned, was just difficult. I mean, you're looking at your child every day who should be running around. I think at that point she was probably like 2 years old in that photo. She should be running around laughing, smiling, saying mama, dad, dad, a bunch of words, and eating. Just something so simple. This kind of situation can really make you like thankful for what you do have. And if you have health, you have wealth. Like you've probably heard that, because looking at her, the emotional side of taking care of her is she can't do anything. Her life was stolen from her. And she fights to live and wants to live, and her life is valuable to her. And that makes it valuable to me. Um, and I would love on her as much as I could, but it's still just in my mind, even to this day, that she should be running around as a 2-year-old. And now, at the time of filming this, let's see, I think she would have just turned eight or 7. She would have just turned 7. So yeah, those things are hard, like, and take an emotional toll on the parents who, have a special needs child. So she really liked to have music or a sound machine going. So we always had a sound machine with like the ocean next to her. Um, so after getting a bed, it made all the difference. That hospital bed right there made such a difference, because you could recline her. And so if she was having like stomach issues, reclining her really helped to kind of relieve those. And then usually there was like always calls to make. You're calling insurance, you're calling for formula, because you had to have, formula all the time, even at 2 years old, and calling for those bed pad things, which that was an out of pocket expense for us, because like the state or whoever, the insurance wouldn't pay for it until she was like 3 years old or something like that. Um, so, there's always like something to be calling about the medications. Now, one thing I can say about the medications, I used to just pick them up at like popular drugstores, and there'd be times I would get there after they said it was ready and it wasn't, and she was out, and like it was extremely stressful because she could not miss a dose. And so when I would be freaking out, I always had to do these horrible, 2-hour phone calls on the phone trying to get a hold of an on-call doctor to call us in immediately. It was stressful. Well, then we found out that if you go to a pharmacy that is like a locally owned pharmacy, they will even usually deliver it to your home. And that changed everything. Like there was no more me going out sitting in line at a pharmacy in, at nighttime after arguing all day on the phone trying to get the medication to push through, because they knew the situation and they even delivered it. So like that was an amazing shift there. Um, but she had peaceful days where she seemed pretty comfortable. And then she had very hard days where she was inconsolable. Nothing helped, even these high-powered medications that she was on. And um, so we sometimes had a nurse at nighttime, but then otherwise it was just myself and at that point Canyon, my husband, who would have to go check on her and give her medication in the middle of the night, things like that. Okay. So this is like around 2020. So, she was shaken in 2017. Um, So there came a time where she just seemed like she was in pain. Like I could tell a shift. Like she had always had these inconsolable times where it could have just been her brain, or it could have been pain, or it could have been something small. But at this point, it was like she's in pain. It was like she was crying out in pain, and I could tell a difference being with her every day. But there was no doctor in the area that would prescribe pain medications to a child who was normal, meaning not on hospice care or palliative care. Okay, well, she hadn't been on that because doctors had no idea she could have lived 15 years. She could have lived 20 years. Like they had no clue. So she wasn't like qualifying for palliative care or hospice care at that point. So even though she had all of these issues, she was technically normal patient or regular patient, whatever you want to call it. And so the closest place was like a 2 hour drive to just go discuss palliative care, and she had to go. Well, first of all, she's already in pain. I have nothing to give her for pain. They said it was because of the opioid crisis. They could not, because laws have been passed for that. And so I was very angry, you know, as someone who had been in a marriage with someone who abused opioids, number one, but number two, as someone who had a child with special needs who needed it, and they were telling me that they could become addicted to opioids and they don't want to give it to children because of that, because of the opioid crisis. And me arguing like she is not going to live a long life. It doesn't matter what the opioids do to her body, and to a certain extent. So like they were like, this could cause issues long term. When she's an adult, she could have like kidney issues and stuff like that. And it's like, this is not that case. She is not a normal 2, 3 year old who is going to live this long life, who has to worry about kidney issues when she's 30 years old, you know? So, um, those laws were preventing it. And then that they would say that the opioid crisis, because of adults abusing opioids, they take it from their children, things like that, they sell it. That's another reason. And so I was angry about that because I had to watch my daughter in pain because of choices that adults were making to abuse drugs. Um, so that's a different scenario, different story. But I had been planning to take her to this place that was 2 hours away to try to get her on palliative care, because that's how strongly I felt that she needed the pain medication when she got placed on hospice care. So I'll tell that story. Okay. So I guess the timing was okay, and I understood why she was in pain because her body was starting to shut down. So just like the prognosis that they had made to where they thought her body was just going to kind of shut down, that is what happened with her. So she always had a temperature that was like 90 degrees. And most people, most doctors, when I told a doctor that, I didn't even tell doctors that anymore. We ran into that constantly at the hospital because her normal was 90 degrees. And that's a rectal temp, because everybody be like, was that rectal or not? So that was just her normal with the way her brain was. And so we would run into issues constantly whenever we would go to the hospital, because they'd be freaking out, putting her in a warming things all the time because she had a 90-degree temperature, and they wanted to get it up into like 95, 96 at least. And I'd have to explain over and over, you're going to overheat her. And, it was just a struggle. So that was one sign, though, that her body was declining, because her normal was at first like 94, 95, and then over time it went down to where like it would not get above 90. So that was one sign that her body was declining, but that happened for a good 6 months before she was placed on hospice care. So the thing that got her put on hospice care was, I walked into the room one day. She had been silent. She had been just fine. And no issues. She hadn't been in the hospital for a while. She just seemed pretty healthy. This was in September of 2020. So she hadn't been in the hospital since January of 2020 for anything like serious, which was a really good thing. So I go into the room and she had this white liquid all over her, like she had vomited. And the thing is, she again could not vomit because she had nothing on her stomach ever. So I knew something was wrong, especially for it to be white. I was like, okay, is there a bowel issue again? Is this coming up from her bowels? What's going on? So I took her to see the doctor, and the doctor was like, yeah, you should probably go to the ER just to get checked out. So I took her there, and that's when they put it together of like, okay, I'm pretty sure they did like a scan on her chest since that's where the fluid came from. So they just determined that with her temperature increasing, like a decreasing over time, like that consistently, and this white fluid, which actually came from her lungs, so it wasn't coming from her stomach, it came up from her lungs. So, like when the lungs, I guess, are starting to shut down, then stuff, can start coming out of them, which is how it was explained to me. So, they finally brought in hospice care, which changed everything because then you can get pain medications and you can get everything you need, extra care, extra help. So they put her on oxygen for comfort measures. It didn't help her. It wasn't going to cure her. It wasn't going to fix her lungs. It was just to keep her comfortable. And so we went home with oxygen and with hospice care, which was, I was extremely like, it's bittersweet. I wasn't happy knowing like, okay, this is the end. This is the end, even though it still could have been, a year, 2 years. There's signs now. So at that point, I made her a DNR because I realized, okay, she's got, her body is trying to shut down whether she wants to fight or not. Her body is shutting down, and that was clear. So that's the point that I said, okay, she's going to be a DNR now, and we're not going to try to resuscitate her and stuff when that time comes and she stops breathing. So, or whatever. I didn't know what to expect actually. So I was relieved to have the care that she actually needed at that time, but also very sad because I didn't know what it was going to be like without her. And that was scary. I was just terrified of what life would be like. So I'm going to talk about the night that she did pass away. So there were times, so her being on hospice care, I basically just said, okay, I'm going to accept that this is happening. I'm going to try my best to prepare. So, like, she was on a hospice care for a total of 2 weeks, but she didn't show, like, oh, she is passing away until, of course, like the day or two before she actually passed away. And even the day of, like, the hospice care nurse would come every day. And then he was like, I noticed that she is got less circulation in her lower limbs, which could mean that she's getting closer to passing away. But I tried to use that time to spend as much time with her, to take photos with her, to, just be with her. And it was terrifying to leave my house. So, like, that 2 weeks that after she got placed on hospice care, it was like, is she going to die when I'm gone? And, that's a scary place to be, to think about. I didn't want her to die alone, which she was never alone. She always had a nurse or somebody there with her, like my mom in the photo there, and then my husband, Kenyon. And so, anyways, so the night she passed away, I kind of knew but didn't know because of how she was reacting. So that entire day, she was on oxygen and she had been having these moments of where she would just like tense up and not breathe, normal breaths for moments at a time. So it was like noticeable. It wasn't just like a pause in breathing, it was a noticeable where her face would turn purple and I thought like she's dying right now. And then she would start breathing again. And what I think was happening was that oxygen was kind of like kicking her breath back in. And so she would breathe again. So, yeah. I'm going to try to tell this and stay on track, but it's so hard to talk about. It's been 3 years, I think, this year, 4 years this year, and it's just kind of hard to talk about. So, um, that day, I was like, okay, I'm not going anywhere. I noticed something's different, even though you still want to be in denial. I was still like, I don't want her to go. This isn't happening. The part of me was like that. And then part of me was like, but I want her to go and get out of this suffering. But then I want her to stay with me. But then, like it was just terrifying. Like what's going to happen? How's it going to happen? It was hard emotionally and mentally. But I am going to tell the details so that in case there's anyone else watching this who experiences this, stuff like that, I want the real details there. And to speak it with boldness and not be afraid to like say the real things here. Okay, so I noticed that the oxygen was kind of like kicking her back into breathing. So I was like, I got to a point where I had a hospice nurse friend who was like, sometimes the oxygen can prolong it. So just see what happens when you take the oxygen off and give it some time. And if she seems like she's suffering, then you can put it back on and help keep her comfortable. But sometimes it can be more harm than help because it can prevent her from going if she's trying to go. So it got to the point. So like I called my mom to come over and stay the night. I was like, I don't know what's gonna happen. Would you come stay? So she was there, and I told her I'm gonna see what happens when we take this oxygen off. I think it's prolonging this, and I don't want to prolong this for her. I don't want to be the one like causing this to drag on. So we did remove the oxygen, and when we did that, there was just major shift. So like you could tell that that's what she was waiting on, basically. And so like a few nights before, maybe the night before, I had went into the room with her alone, and I had basically had this conversation with her. Now I know that the doctor would say she can't understand anything, but she knows me, she knows my voice, and who knows what she could really understand. No one could actually tell that. And so I went in and had a conversation with her. I was like, Krista, you have fought very hard. You have, you know, you've suffered so much, and I'm so sorry for what you've been through. And I love you so much. And I want you to know that I'm okay, that you can go. You don't have to, struggle anymore. You don't have to fight this anymore. You can go. I will be okay. Don't stay for me. And so I was just having that conversation like you would just an adult, just someone who could hear. But so I had that conversation with her the night before. And so it was the night after. And so we removed the oxygen, and you could tell that there was this shift. So whenever she would like catch her breath, there was no more um it wasn't the same. Okay, that's the only way I can really explain that. And then her O2, we had an O2 sensor like for her finger, and her O2 would, was slowly going down. And so I'm like, this is it. I know this is it. So that was probably around like 11 o'clock at night. And when it really started, and so I called the pastor, our pastor who had been with us really since I was like 8 years old, but through all this, especially through this situation. And he came to stay with us. And so there was no nurse there at that time. But I was terrified, to say the least, because I was worried like she cannot be in pain right now. And they had given us morphine to give her. Um, and they had the regulations for that. Like they had a specific amount and a specific emergency dose, stuff like that. So we immediately gave that to her. When I realized she was like turning purple, she was definitely, her breathing was more labored and longer in between. So you usually take your regular breaths. Well, she was going a long time without it. So it did seem like she was like fighting up into the last breath. So there was moments where she did wrench, and it seemed like she was in pain. And Thankfully, those didn't last and she would calm back down. So I just held her and sang to her, tried not to freak out. I knew I had to be strong for her. And in the inside, I was freaking out and like wanted to just die with her. That is how it felt. And so, um, oh, one detail I left out. This entire time, I did involve her biological father. So he had texted me as we were going back and forth with supervised visitations. He had texted me from a certain phone number. So I texted that same phone number, which later on he tried to say that was an app he was using. He no longer had the app, so he never got any of these messages. So whenever I found out she was placed on hospice care, I told him first before I made it like public on social media through that phone number. Well, I never heard anything from him. I told him he could video call her. I wasn't going to give him my address to come see her, and she couldn't get out. So he could video call her if he wanted to tell her goodbye or say anything to her. Never heard anything from this phone number. So this night, when I knew she was going to die, I said, I think this is her last night. Like she's going to pass away. Do you want a video call? And never heard anything. So months later, after that in court, I had those printed out to show that I did do that. And so in court, that was the first time he realized that I did try to get a hold of him because he was trying to use that against me in court, that I never let him know about this except what he saw on social media. And so like I could tell when he read those text messages proof that he was, upset that he had the opportunity to say goodbye and he didn't because he was for whatever reason texting me off of this app instead of using his actual phone number. So excuse me, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Okay. So around 3 a.m., I think it was like 3:15, 3:16 in the morning is when she did take her last breath. And so this was agonizing, absolutely agonizing. And it wasn't that long of an amount of time, but the time that you just sitting there not knowing what breath is the last for 4 hours straight was absolutely agonizing. And when she did take her last breath, you could hear what they call the death rattle, which I didn't know about. I wasn't expecting. So just in case you need to know this information for the future to prepare yourself or to know that this is actually the last breath, it's this sound that apparently like when they take their last breath, it kind of like rattles the lungs or something or the rib cage. I don't know. But it was a different sound than any other sound. And so that was like the final, she actually has passed away because there was so much time length in between breaths that it was hard to talk. Is she going to do another one? Um, but thankfully, she passed away peacefully. It could not have gone better. And that's weird to say about a death anyway, but she was there in our arms, in our own bed, in our own home, and it was peaceful. And she just took her last breath that way. So, very sad situation, very sad story. But, there were things that were just so helpful during that time, like the hospice care. It lined up to be, perfect for the situation. And we had a dog at the time, a puppy, and there was somebody who like offered to take her that entire time for free, a kennel place, like a dog training place. So like there was all these little things that helped so much during this time to make this peaceful as it could be. Um, so yeah, there's more photos. Again, it's painful to look at these photos, but this is the real deal. Like I'm showing you the real moments. And like the bottom right photo was a photo from our like camera that we always had on her, which shows like when we realized she was gone. So I did have emotions of anger. So I had coped with and dealt with a lot of anger, of course, of like someone doing this to her. And I had gotten through it and I had chosen to forgive and move forward for my own good, my own self and my beliefs. And so as soon as she passed away though and she was gone, I just had like a flood of anger. First of all, I was joyful that she did not have to suffer and of what she was seeing. I was that I felt joy. And then I felt deep anguish and sorrow because my baby was gone. And like my husband will, every once in a while, if we see a movie or something where something happens to the child and the person is like yelling, my baby, or they're just very upset saying my baby, like he said, there was moments where that was me. And so like it almost gives him trauma from that moment when we see someone else like in a movie or something acting that way because it reminds him of that moment. But so for me, you know, I felt anger too. I was like, I can't believe you did this. You killed her. You did this to her. And so like I had to cope and deal with that anger because it didn't help anything to have it. Um, there's nothing to be done. So a question I do get real quick mentioning that is, well, why couldn't you have taken him back to court after she passed away because of she was then dead? So it would be like a homicide case or something. Well, I did try that and it would have messed with our step parent adoption. So I chose not to try to pursue that because keeping my daughter safe was more important than trying to get someone put in jail. So I can talk more about that in a minute. Um, but her funeral, so she passed about October 13th, 2020. We had her funeral. I did allow him to come to a private viewing. So he did contact me after I posted to social media that she passed away, and he was, saying he's going to come see her, whatever, where's she at, all these things. So at that point, he hadn't seen her. I can't even remember how long it had been, but he hadn't seen her probably for months, if I remember correctly. Um, because once I got married, I didn't mention this, but once I got married to Canyon for whatever reason, her biological father kind of like fell away. Like he wasn't really texting anything. He texted my current husband Canyon and he kind of sent him like this little threatening message where he was saying, you better not be fighting in front of my kids, and like, just stuff that he didn't even know anything about. And so but it wasn't like, hey, please, can you talk her into letting me see the kids? Like it was nothing about seeing the kids or talking about the kids at all. It was So that was the only contact we really had with him for months, up until this point of where he was demanding to see her at the funeral. So I will tell that story real quick because I think it was remorseful. I think it was kind of important to know this part. Um, so he came and I had told him he needs to be alone. He cannot bring his family because I did not want issues. I didn't want them to say things. I knew how they acted and how his mother had responded in the hospital over him being there. Like I just knew that it would cause problems. So I said, don't bring anyone. Um, so he ended up bringing like his mom's friend, who I didn't know, but was an extremely dramatic person. That's all I knew about her. And so, of course, he comes in, he's slings the door open of the funeral home area and walks into the room where her casket is, and she's there. So he immediately drops to the floor crying and like wailing, which I thought was true. I thought that was like true remorse, true feelings, and I believed it, that was real and that maybe he was finally feeling what he did. And so I'm standing there like, I almost feel bad for you because you really are hurting. Like it's hard even though it was a human who did so much to me, who harmed me and my child in so many ways, it's still hard to see someone in such deep anguish. Um, and I had never seen that from him. So he's on the floor, like wailing and trying to crawl up to her, basically. And then this family friend comes in, and apparently the mom was in the car, which I told could not come in. She hadn't ever tried to visit her, hadn't really tried to be involved in her life, anyways. And so, um, this woman is like, he needs his mama. I'm going to go get his mama. And I'm like, no, you're not. And so she starts arguing with me. I'm arguing back. And then, of course, he turns and starts to argue. So it's this big yelling match at that point. Whenever, if he had just come alone, he probably could have just had this moment of sorrow and then left. Um, so, anyways, so they end up walking out after all that screaming match drama. And um, so yeah, that was that. I just wanted to mention that he did finally get to see her, and he did show some remorse after all this time. Um, but on the one thing he was concerned with, that he was like yelling about, was, you better put her name as Hunt on the stone. Because at that point he knew that we were trying to do a step parent adoption and that her name would be changed to Cook. She passed away in the middle of this step parent adoption that we were doing, which would have made Kenyon her legal guardian and changed her last name. And so he knew that. And so he was going on about how her stone, which he wasn't even going to pay for, better say his name on it. And that's what his concern was. So, anyways, I even said, fine, if that's what you want, sure. And that was the end of it. So he left, extremely upset. I left upset because of that situation. And that was the end of it. Thankfully, he didn't try to show up at any other time, like during the public um, funeral or the burial and stuff. So the left photo is at the burial, and then the right photos are, at the funeral. Um, okay, so after she passed away, I'm kind of going to give just a little bit of these, what it's like after, because it's still part of like this shaken baby journey. My identity, I probably went through an identity crisis, as they call it, because it's like, who am I now? I don't know who I am. From the moment that she passed away, we walked upstairs. I didn't want to see them carrying her out of our home. And so, because I just didn't want that image every time I walked by, the front door, the image of her being carried out. And so I didn't mention this part, but like, so we went upstairs out of that house to wait for the ambulance. Like, we had to call the hospice care, wait for them to get there, for them to be able to call her time of death. And what we didn't know was going to happen, though, was what they called in a forensic autopsy, which I didn't care. I was fine with that, but I just didn't know that that was even going to happen. But so when the ambulance got there, I went ahead and just went up to stand outside of the home, so I didn't have those images. And it was a very strange feeling, because when she was placed on the ambulance for them to take her to the place to do the autopsy, I felt like just such a powerful, motherly urge to get on that ambulance with her. Like, it was the first time that my baby was taken for any reason, and I wasn't with her. I wasn't going through it with her. I wasn't, you know, holding her hand. And so, like, that moment still gets to me, because everything in me said, don't let them take her, like, she's leaving without you, like, get on there. So, when we walked back in our home after the final time that she was placed, on the ambulance, gosh, I'm trying my best not to cry, but that's just like such a moment still. Um, you know, that's when I was first struck with like, what do I do now? This house is quiet. There's no oxygen tank. There is nothing, like all I do is think about her. That's my job. I take care of her. For years that had been my job. And so then I was like, who am I now? What do I even do? So, um I had to go through that struggle. So like you can see that picture when she was born and then her I think that was like Easter, and then her afterwards, after her injury, just taking care of her. And then on the right was what it was like after, which was just me, my husband, and our older daughter Bradley. And so that was a big process to go through that I really wasn't expecting. Like I knew that when the day came that she passed away, I kind of expected like this relief of like, I no longer have to do this, which was just like the selfish part of me, which is not selfish because no one wants to have to do all these things all the time, which, you know, so, but I was also had the expectation of not having to deal with like her suffering and like that pain gone. The worry of her suffering every day would be gone. And so like I expected this huge relief, but what I didn't expect was like this intense sorrow. This because I had it in my mind that I know she's going to pass away one day. I've come to terms with that. I accept it and understand it. So it must be easier to lose someone because I had lost my father at 13 completely unexpectedly and sudden. And so I knew what it was like to not get to tell someone goodbye, to not, have any last words, to not know they're going to pass away. And so I thought this has to be easier because I know she's going to pass away. I know that that's, what's going to happen eventually. And so I could kind of prepare for that in some way. And that's just, it wasn't the case for me. I actually might have prolonged my suffering because I was expecting it to be easier because I had the time to kind of prepare for that, but it wasn't for me. It was now I'm hit with this intense sorrow, this anguish, this pain, my heart was physically hurting. It felt like every part of me hurt physically, which I wasn't expecting those things. I was just kind of expecting like I'm going to have this grieving period and I'm going to cry and I'm going to feel sad, but I wasn't expecting like this physical aching pain and for it to feel like I don't know what to do now. I miss taking care of her. I never thought I would miss having to take care of someone 24/7, things like that. So I had to go through all of that. And then our step parent adoption. So I didn't mention much about this. And I don't know if I think I accidentally deleted a slide or skipped past it. But I had put on here our step parent adoption details. So a month or two before Krista passed away, we had filed for a step parent adoption. So in our state and laws and stuff at the time, if a parent is basically just gone, like they don't try to make any contact for 4 months, then you can file for a step parent adoption. Well, when I had this idea to file for a step parent adoption, which I had no idea, like it wasn't like planned. It was like, oh, we're going to do whatever it takes to get this step parent adoption. It was actually the advocate attorney for her who even brought this up to my attention. Because we were just having a random conversation with this advocate attorney at the hospital who I was telling about the situation and said, I do supervised visits. And he said, oh, did you know about this place? So apparently there's places out there that do supervised visitations, but it's neutral. It's like a neutral person. So instead of me having to go to like meet him in a public place like McDonald's or the park, which was still scary and dangerous because he could have done anything, it's a neutral place that would it's kind of like set up by DCS for these specific cases where there is the custody issue, abuse issue, and where you need someone to write down everything that happens. So I was like, oh, I didn't know that existed. I would have been doing that this entire time. So when I told him that we were from then on going to do meetings at this place, that was a neutral place. So I would go drop the kids off in this room that was created for like visits to play and stuff like that, with a person to supervise who would be writing down everything. And then like I would leave and then he would come in to the room. So it would be like we never had to be in contact, and it would avoid any kind of like, confrontation. And that's great. So I thought that's the best thing that I have ever heard at this point as far as supervised visits go. So whenever I told him, all he had to do was like fill out this application that they make you do with some information, and they will send times in between us. So they would email us what times work for each other, and we wouldn't have to communicate anymore. And I thought that would be great. And so whenever I decided to start doing visits like that, whenever I discovered it was a thing, he just dropped off. He would not turn in the application. He would not try to do the visits. And I'm guessing it was because he knew he would mess up and it would be recorded and he would, or was his ego like, no, we're doing it my way and that's going to be at McDonald's or whatever. Um, so after 4 months went by and he had still refused to go to that place, then we filed for the step parent adoption. And unfortunately, Krista passed away in the middle of that. But not long after, okay, so we had to go to court like 4 separate times for this, when usually it takes one time and everything's done. But he had a very difficult attorney who was trying to make everything drug out. And it was a very trying time for me to just wait, because here's the thing about this. I knew that this was my one chance to protect our older daughter in the best way that I could. And so if I could get his rights removed, he couldn't ever petition the court again. Because up until that point, he still could have went and taken those classes that the original court date mentioned and went to counseling and all these things, and petitioned the court and could have potentially got custody back of our older daughter, meaning he could have been alone with her. And that was terrifying. But, I just held on to my beliefs and things like that, that she would be protected from that. So I knew that this step parent adoption was my shot to protect her and get his rights taken away for good, and that he could never petition the court again because she would have a new legal father. So he, of course, fought that, even though we hadn't heard from him in like 4 months. And in the end, after all that, oh, it was an agonizing time going back and forth. But after all of that, he basically, the judge was like, so we didn't even bring up the shaken baby case in that, because it would have made things like more difficult. So we actually just went on the grounds of, you haven't contacted about your children in 4 months. And that's the grounds that we won on. And he had every opportunity to. So the judge was like, if I had been given the opportunity to go petition the court, if I just took these classes, went to counseling, I would have been doing it the next day. I would have been at the court door every single morning that they were open, trying to petition for custody back. And it's been 3 years and you haven't even tried. And he told him, and with this visitation, you had every way to see your kids if you had just turned in this application and contacted the people who contacted you, and you had conversation with, you knew that it was, going on, and you did nothing. And so he basically explained, you didn't even try, and so that's why you're losing your rights. And so that we won that day, and oh my gosh, that's the best feeling. That was the absolute best feeling, to know that he could never harm her, that he could never go back to court, and he couldn't threaten me anymore to take me to court to get custody. And so that was a great feeling. but it took a whole year from the time that we filed. I'm pretty sure it was about a year. And that was a long waiting period. But like it says, it did give us like this new bittersweet freedom, because at that point we had to stay in that one area because we had to do supervised visits once a month. And then with Krista, it was bittersweet because she was gone. And that was the bitter part. But we had no more restrictions. So like for all that time, it was always okay, if there's a nurse there, then we have from 7 to 7. We have to do everything from 7 to 7. If we go anywhere, if we do anything, we couldn't leave the state, we couldn't go on vacation, we couldn't do anything because, we couldn't take her with us. And so if we wanted to go to the park after 7 p.m. after the nurse left, it could only be one of us. We couldn't get her out and take her. One of us had to stay with her. So there was this new bittersweet freedom of like, what do we do now? We have this freedom from him. He's not forcing us to have to stay, because my husband grew up on the coast in North Carolina. And so like that sounds like a great place to start over on the beach. Like we could go start, a new life there. There were just options. So um I had my own massage practice at that time, and my husband was doing his own thing, and we ended up like we have now 3 children, two, after Krista, and we've been able to go different places and do different things. So it is a bittersweet freedom, but it is a beautiful part of the story, because what could have crushed me and what could have destroyed my entire life, it ended up being okay. And, I miss her every single day. There is not a day that I don't think of her. Even now, this year of 2024 will be 4 years. And I still think of her every day, and I still wish she was in this photo standing there next to Briley. So there are very sad parts to the story, but very beautiful parts of how things can be restored and lives don't have to be over just because, very hard things happen. We can be resilient and we can persevere and we can come up from the ashes of these terrible things that happened to us. So yes, so that's basically life since then and now, which this is the closing of our story. So if you have stayed this long, thank you for that. I know this was a long story, but I wanted to give details because I feel like it matters. If this can help one person out there, if you are a parent who can show this to your teenager, to be able to just educate them some, because you know how it is. Like when you're a teenager, you don't want to listen to your parents exactly, or you don't believe them, or you think they're just being overprotective, but you might listen to someone else telling their story. And so, I just graduated high school when this started. And so, when you're showing this to someone who is close to that age, a teenager, and you show them that it can happen to people, I had every potential ahead of me. At 18 years old, graduating from high school, I went to college, and then I dropped out and made these bad decisions. And that doesn't have to happen. And I didn't know what I didn't know. And so whenever you can show this to people, it might prevent something from happening. And that's my hope with this, is that by sharing all these details, by sharing what I wish I had done, by sharing the dark side of my experiences, that it could save someone else from having to go through it. And sometimes it does come easier from someone who isn't like a parent or a guardian of someone, because you just know how it is when you're a teenager trying to get advice from your parents. But you can take my advice or my experience and not repeat the experience, and just to know that shaken baby syndrome exists, and it can happen to people you will least expect it. It doesn't have to be some big dramatic story. It could be a moment of weakness. And so even for you to personally know that if it gets to that point where you're so stressed with a baby because they're crying and crying and they won't stop crying, whatever it is, to just walk away from them, to lay them down and walk away. It's better for them to like wear themselves out crying than it would be for a moment of weakness for you or your, you know, spouse or boyfriend or whoever it is to, in that moment of weakness, to do something they regret for the rest of their life. Um, but thank you for helping me spread awareness about this. This is what I wish I had known. I wish I could go back and like see this story back then, because it most likely wouldn't have gotten to that point for me. And so thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing this. And please let me know any thoughts that you have. You can always message me. You can send me an email at info@sierracook.com. You can find me under Shaken Baby Mom on social media and contact me there. Um, but I just want to say thank you and check under the different lessons for different. Now, this was just my personal story, but I also have actual facts and education about shaken baby syndrome and then some other things in the lessons in this course. Okay, I'm trying to get this to turn off now. Let's see.